My name is George R. Bolin, and this is my story. In mid to late 1968, I received a telephone call from Jim Hargrove, Senior Vice President and Chief Financial Officer of Texas Eastern Transmission Corporation, the owner and operator of the Big and Little Inch pipelines. He requested that I come downtown to his office. Upon arriving at his office, he proceeded to tell me the events leading up to our meeting. His office was on the east side of the 12th floor of what was then known as the Southern National Bank Building, 1000 McKinney, Houston, Texas. His office window faced east, and he pointed to a vacant little block immediately below and explained that Texas Eastern had acquired that entire block for future development. He had recently made a proposal to the Shell Oil Company to build an office building for their home office. He was asked where he would park their cars should he be successful in his bid, and he responded that he would buy some additional land and build a garage. Shell said they could not take a chance on that, so his proposal was rejected. Jim told me that he never wanted that to happen to him again, so he wanted me to buy all of the 3 adjoining blocks. Jim Hargrove explained that he had the authority to do this and he had the money to do it. He instructed me to open a bank account in the name of George R. Bolin, trustee, at my bank, and that I was not to discuss this with anyone else. Whenever I needed money to buy a property, I was to let him know, and he would put the money in my trustee account. I had my marching orders, and I went to work, tracking down owners, negotiating, and closing on the various properties that made up these 3 blocks. After several months of very hard work, I had acquired about 2/3 of these 3 blocks when I received another call from Mr. Hargrove requesting that I come to his office immediately. Upon arriving there, he informed me that President Nixon had just appointed him as Assistant Postmaster General, and he was leaving forthwith for Washington. Since no one knew what we had been doing, he instructed me to take his assistant, Gordon Jennings, into his office and explain everything to him. Jim then wished me good luck, and he was gone. I took Gordon Jennings into Jim Hargrove's office and began explaining what we had already acquired and what we were still working on. After I finished, Gordon asked me what the status was of the rest of the property that was visible from that east-facing window. I responded I had no idea. He then asked me to do a study for him of the availability of all the property from San Jacinto Street over to the elevated Highway 59 and from Dallas to Rusk. I remember thinking to myself that he must be crazy. I returned to my office and did nothing except continue working on the 3-block area that Jim and I had already started. About 2 weeks later, Gordon called and inquired as to the progress of my study. I felt embarrassed for not having done anything on his request, so I started some limited research as to the ownership and availability of the property from San Jacinto Street over to Crawford Street, approximately 4 blocks wide, from Dallas to Rusk. I told Gordon I would probably have something for him to look at in about another 2 weeks. I completed this area of study, prepared what I call book number 1, and presented it to Gordon within the 2-week period. I took this study as prepared down to Gordon's office and met with him to explain my findings. We started going through my presentation when Gordon noticed that I had stopped at Crawford and had not gone all the way to the elevated Highway 59. He inquired as to why I had done this, and I explained that I had arbitrarily stopped as I saw no need to continue. Gordon at this point closed the book and said if I did not want to do what he asked, he would find someone who did. I was then excused. I returned to my office and immediately started on book number 2, covering the rest of the property. I finished my research and called Gordon on a Friday afternoon to tell him I was now fully prepared. He instructed me to be in his office at 8 a.m. on Monday morning. I arrived at Gordon's office at 8 a.m. on Monday morning and met with him and a Texas Eastern CPA by the name of Jim Brannon. We spent several hours going over my presentation, and about 10:30 they thanked me and dismissed me. Gordon then took the 2 books to the president of Texas Eastern, Baxter Goodrich. He explained to Mr. Goodrich what he had done and gave the presentation to him. Mr. Goodrich said he planned on having lunch at noon with the chairman of the board, George R. Brown, at the Ramada Club, and that he would show this study to him. The dining room of the Ramada Club also faced east, so they would be looking directly down on this property. Mr. Brown, after lunch, decided to take the two books home with him that evening so he could more closely study the results. The next morning at 9 a.m. was a Texas Eastern board meeting. Mr. Brown presented the study to the board and suggested that they should buy all of the property. There was a motion made and passed with only one dissenting vote. About 2 p.m. on Tuesday, I received a call from Gordon Jennings requesting that I come to his office at 8 a.m. on Wednesday morning for another meeting. I asked him what the meeting was about, and he said that Texas Eastern wanted to buy that property. I then asked which piece he was talking about, and he said, "We want to buy all of it." As you might well imagine, I was completely blown away. Texas Eastern wanted to buy 33 blocks of downtown Houston and wanted me to be their broker. Needless to say that after a sleepless night, I was in Gordon's office long before 8 o'clock the next morning. We started trying to make some decisions as to how to go about such a monumental task. First, we decided to buy all properties in the name of George R. Bolin trustees so that no one would think there were competing parties seeking the same properties. This proved to be a very wise decision. When we started assembling the 33 square block area, the tallest structure was a 7-story pigeonhole parking garage that covered about a quarter of one block. The remaining structures were either 1, 2, or 3-story older buildings. About 50% of the properties were grade-level parking lots or auto dealerships. With only a couple of exceptions, there were almost no valuable improvements in the entire area. There were a total of 160 properties involved, so we agreed we would need more than just me to efficiently contact, offer, and negotiate with each owner. I was able to identify approximately 5 brokers within my firm, being Jack DeBobin, Coach Garrell, Tom Sonnenberg, Miles Anderson, and myself. We still felt this was not enough, so I contacted a competitor to my firm, Jim Schindler, who readily agreed to help and brought with him Ed Cummings, Barry Smith, and Fred Miller. Our team was beginning to assemble. In addition to Gordon Jennings and Jim Brannon, Texas Eastern provided a couple of in-house attorneys, Curran Houston and Charlie Staffa, and a young lady by the name of Annie Fabio, to set up a management company. The idea was that once we had actually closed the purchase of a property, it would be turned over to Annie to oversee the management of the property to derive the highest income possible and hold the line on expenses. All of this planning was done in the spring of 1969. The team was provided a 2-room office on the top of the Southern National Bank building, which again looked east over all the subject property. To access this office required taking the elevator to the top floor, walking the hallway all the way around the building, going into, through, and out of the computer room, and then climbing a flight of stairs. In order to hide our identity and purpose, the computer room people were told that we were IRS agents doing an investigation of Texas Eastern, and they were not to interfere with us for any reason. With 15 or so people going in and out several times a day, the man in charge of the computer room was becoming impatient. One day he had had enough and stood blocking the entrance, not allowing us to pass through his computer room. He did not care who we were. I had no choice but to go to the president of Texas Eastern and explain our dilemma. Mr. Goodrich then accompanied me back to the computer room and explained who he was, and that if the young man wished to retain his job, he would let us pass regardless of what hardships we caused the computer room. He finally got the message. During our planning process, I had several aerial shots of the area, enlarged and coordinated with some corresponding blocks drawn to the same scale. These were mounted on some wall boards and carried by me up to our new office on the top of the Southern National Bank building. All these panels were wrapped in paper so as to not be visible to anyone until unwrapped. I was then directed to a work crew that was doing some remodeling in the building with instructions to have the carpenter's superintendent accompany me to our penthouse for the purpose of mounting these panels on our walls. He did a very professional job, and when he was finished and we were admiring his work, he asked me when we were going to talk to him about his property. I was stunned, to say the least. He then pointed to a property in the very middle of our target area and explained that he was the president of the Knights of Columbus, who owned a quarter of a block. He then assured me that they would not be a problem, as they had just acquired the property from the Catholic Women's Organization, and they would trade us for a new building built to their specification on a property he had already had in mind. The cost of the new building was well within our budget, so we agreed to the deal. What was unnerving about the whole thing was the fact that the very first person outside of our team to be exposed to our plan was a property owner within our target area. All of the property was located in the same subdivision of the city known as Southside Buffalo Bayou, or SSBB for short. Within that subdivision, all the blocks are numbered, so we set up a filing system using the block number. Within the block, I had started at the top left-hand corner and numbered the ownership in a clockwise motion. I had taken a picture from across the street of every property so one could look at the block and see what was located on that particular site. We therefore had a file on each property that would read something like 142-3. Hopefully that would not mean anything to anyone except members of our team. Curran Houston decided he did not want title insurance policies for any of the properties, but rather requested block abstracts for each block, which he then delivered to Vincent Elkins' law firm. Curran had previously worked at VE, so he was able to handpick those attorneys that he felt most comfortable with to do the block abstract examination and provide him with an opinion as to the validity of each ownership. The VE team was headed by Virgil Dixie Davis and consisted of approximately 20 attorneys. We hired 2 examiners with Harris County Abstract Company to build the block abstracts. They were headed by John Sontag and Bill Curry, who also were assisted by their wives. We entered into an agreement with American Title Company to have 2 of their top executives, Roland Chamberlain and Harold Scoggins, actually handle all of the closings in order to minimize any last-minute problems. In several instances, this proved to be a very wise decision. Curran Houston, Charlie Staffa, and Annie Fabio prepared the deeds and included a Mother Hubbard catch-all phrase in order to cover any gaps or vacancies that might have existed. Each property ownership was presented to our team of brokers, who identified anyone who might have a personal or prior relationship. Jim Schindler had a relationship with Lester Goodson Pontiac Company, so he was assigned the responsibility of that property. There were several additional relationships that were identified and assigned. The management team, consisting of Gordon, Curran, Jim, Charlie, and myself, proceeded to do a drive-by type of an appraisal of each property and assigned a value to it. This value was used to establish the initial offer and for the basis of the commission to be paid to each broker. We had agreed to a brokerage fee of 4.5% of this appraised value, with an additional fee of 10% of anything we were able to save under this value. There would be no additional fees should the cost exceed this value. Generally, the initial offers made to the owners were at about 75% of this appraised value. We all agreed that any and all commissions and fees would be paid by Texas Eastern. Since all the team knew what we were attempting to do, we did not ever want a seller to later claim that because of this knowledge we were not properly representing them. At all times we were working for Texas Eastern, no exceptions. Curran, Charlie, and Annie drew up contracts for each property with an initial offer, and then on June 1st, 1969, we hit the streets with written offers in hand. Our objective was to present each owner a written offer within 3 days. We actually were able to accomplish this goal. All the brokers were authorized to agree to the purchase up to our appraised value without any additional approval by Texas Eastern. Within our target area, there were 3 properties with for sale signs on them, and we were instructed to sign them up on the first day, as we felt they presented the greatest exposure of being lost to someone who might then try and hold us up. There were a few interesting sales processes that didn't initially go smoothly. The Salvation Army had just completed a new building within our target area. The sales pitch I was able to make to the general was that here was a chance to correct any errors or omissions for a newer building. Several items had already come to his attention. One was that his restroom needed to have a small dressing room attached. The other was that he had no place to store his lawnmower when it was not in use. We found a suitable site to relocate Salvation Army, built a new facility that corrected the previous omissions, and traded the two properties. Mr. Navarro owned about a quarter of a block, and his property was assigned to Barry Smith. After many months of negotiating and actually closing the purchase while he was in the hospital, Mr. Navarro died the next day. Ms. Fitch owned a 2-story boarding house on Dallas Avenue that she initially refused to even talk to us about selling. I made multiple visits to her during the first several months. She was a lady who canned or preserved all sorts of fruits and vegetables and made and sold fruitcakes during the holidays. During my first 10 or 12 visits, I had to stand on her porch and talk to her through a screened door. Finally, one day she was busy in her kitchen, so she reluctantly allowed me to come in and stand in the kitchen and talk to her. She had been planning on going to Hawaii to visit her son, who was in the Army, and see her grandchildren. On this particular day, she was in tears, as her panel truck had broken down and she was going to have to spend her Hawaii money to have it repaired. I returned to Texas Eastern with her story and requested $750 cash so she could still go to Hawaii. They agreed and advanced me the money. I immediately returned to Ms. Fitch's house with the money so she could still go see her family. From that day on, I was always welcome in her home, and we were able to work out a deal whereby we bought the land under her house. She could live there free for 5 years, and then she could take her house with her or leave it for us. David and Marianne Jew owned a Chinese restaurant on the smallest property within the 33 blocks. We finally arrived at an agreed price, and we presented them with a 2-page cash contract. They gave it to their Chinese attorney, who proceeded to handwrite all kinds of changes in the margin, in between lines, and even on the back. We were unable to decipher any of it, so we started over. We presented the same 2-page contract, only to have it come back to us with many different changes handwritten all over it. Curran Houston, our attorney, said to me, "Go ahead and sign the contract, even though it was worthless." His reasoning was that they thought it was valid, and all he wanted was a signed deed without change. Lester Goodson Pontiac Company was an interesting transaction. His property totaled about 1 city block. His attorney was Bill Elkins with Vincent and Elkins, so we had to be very careful to avoid any conflict of interest. Jim Schindler was assigned this property, and I was asked to assist. We held numerous meetings with Mr. Elkins' office, and finally were able to negotiate a very unusual deal. We identified a vacant property on I-45 North, just inside Beltway 8, that Mr. Goodson liked as a site to move his dealership. We bought this acreage and traded this vacant property for his downtown property. We then paid him in cash an additional $400,000. Since this was considered a capital gain for him, he paid the 25% tax and had $300,000 cash remaining with which to build his new dealership. The trade allowed him to take his minimal basis in his downtown land into the new vacant property, and the cash he paid for his improvements could then be depreciated for additional tax savings. On 1 city block, after all the closings, it was noted that we were missing a 25-foot square in the center of the block. No one had conveyed that property to us, and the ownership showed to be in the name of Jonas P. Rice. Although we searched diligently, we were unable to find Mr. Rice. Curran was therefore compelled to prepare a lawsuit called a trespass and tri-title suit to clear the ownership question. Prior to filing the suit, I was invited to a luncheon by my father-in-law, Bob Cullum, being held by the Dr. Pepper Bottling Company, as he was a member of their board. At this luncheon, Bob introduced me to his co-board member, Joe Rice, from Winston-Salem, North Carolina. During our lunch visit, I asked Mr. Rice if he had ever been to Houston prior to today. His response was that he actually had been born in Houston, in what is now downtown Houston, and that his family lived on Lamar Avenue. I then asked him if the name Jonas P. Rice meant anything to him, and he laughingly replied that he was Jonas P. Rice. I immediately excused myself and went to a payphone, contacted Curran to tell him of my discovery. Curran gave me some directions as to how to proceed, and I returned to our table to further discuss our situation with Mr. Rice. He then told me there was no need to file the lawsuit, as he was certain that his father had intended to sell all of his property when they moved, and if I would simply have a deed prepared for him to sign, he would gladly do so. Wow, talk about luck. The Chinese Baptist Church was an interesting negotiation. This property was assigned to Jack DeBobin, and it required him to attend the Sunday service for a number of weeks in a row. Jack would speak to the congregation in English, and an interpreter would relay his message in Chinese. They would ask questions in Chinese, which he, in turn, would translate into English for Jack. After several months, a deal was made and everyone left happy. Much later, after the church had relocated to Southwest Houston, Texas Eastern was having the old church building demolished, and the bulldozer raising the building fell into the basement area. No one had been advised that a basement even existed. Fortunately, the dozer operator was unhurt when it fell into the hole. One property which we all missed in our evaluations was a nondescript, windowless, two-story warehouse. It was owned and occupied by ADT Alarm System. It seems that every alarm monitored by ADT was routed into this building. When we attempted to buy the property, the only way possible was to build a new facility including all duplicate monitoring systems, and when ready, throw a switch, transferring all electronics from the old building to the new one. Fortunately, ADT was in the process of building a new facility in Oklahoma and had all new equipment ready for delivery. The deal we made was to divert that equipment to Houston, put it in the new facility here, which we built, and then remove the existing equipment and ship it to Oklahoma. All told, this ended up costing us about $1 million more than we anticipated. The only property we actually lost to another buyer was owned by John Crooker. Upon our initial contact with Mr. Crooker, he agreed to sell his property to us at an agreed price. We prepared a contract and returned several days later, only to learn that he had sold his property to an adjoining landowner. We were unsuccessful in negotiating a purchase from this owner, and he remained as one of the 5 holdouts. However, his entire property was in the area that Texas Eastern donated to the City of Houston for the George R. Brown Convention Center, and the city proceeded to condemn all of this property and acquire it at considerably less than we had offered the owner. I guess sometimes you can be too smart for your own good. 3 of the properties ended up costing us considerably more than they should have, and all 3 were caused by an error on the part of some Texas Eastern executive. The first was owned by Henry Taub, who was a friend of one of the directors. This director insisted that he could deliver this property, and he did. The problem was that Mr. Taub had inserted a favored nations clause into the contract, which called for us to match the highest price we paid for any other property. This caused the price to jump from about $10 a square foot to over $100 per square foot. The second was occasioned by Mr. Goodrich insisting that he could deliver a site owned by Houston Lang and Power Company. He said he was a good friend of their president, Perk Robinson. Mr. Goodrich was warned that Mr. Robinson could not be trusted, but he said that he could handle it. Mr. Robinson was then informed of Texas Eastern's intentions, and he promptly responded that the HL&P's property was not available. Much later, and at a much higher price, we finally acquired this piece. Finally, there was the Joe Connie, the largest property owner in the target area, as he owned a full block, 2 half blocks, and a quarter of another block. Mr. Connie had offered all of his property to me for $2 million. I had offered $1.8 million, but he had consistently countered it at $2 million. Gordon finally asked me to bring Mr. Connie to his office so he could handle this transaction. I strongly objected to this idea, but Gordon insisted, and he was the boss. I told Mr. Connie that my boss wanted to meet him, and he agreed to the meeting. I delivered Mr. Connie to Gordon's office, and on the way, Mr. Connie confirmed his price of $2 million. I introduced the two of them, and before Mr. Connie could even speak, Gordon asked him who within his organization had the authority to make a deal. This question completely insulted Mr. Connie, who quickly jumped to his feet, slammed shut his briefcase, and proceeded to cuss Gordon. He explained that he was his organization, and he wanted to know who at Texas Eastern had as much authority. The next time they wanted to talk to him, bring the president and come to his office. With that said, his price was now $4 million, and not a penny less. He started out the door, and Gordon suddenly said, "Okay, we would pay $4 million for the property." Mr. Connie stopped in his tracks, turned to me, and said maybe he was dealing with the right person. We did, in fact, end up paying him his price, plus we paid him an additional $100,000 per year to continue running the Mike Persia Chevrolet Company that occupied the site. So much for letting the executives negotiate the purchases. In approximately January of 1970, we had about 50% of the entire area closed into the name of George R. Bolin, trustee, when Gordon notified me that we needed to pick up the pace as we were running out of time. Texas Eastern had an annual meeting coming up in early March, and they could not withhold information from their stockholders. This meant that we needed to offer more to get the properties under contract. We were able to do this, and by the time of the annual meeting, we had all but 5 of the 160 different properties either closed or under contract. Texas Eastern then offered to give approximately 8 blocks on the east end of the project to the City of Houston for the George R. Brown Convention Center. 4 of the 5 holdouts were within this 8-block area, and the city promptly condemned them. I believe they all got considerably less than we had already offered them. The final holdout was about a quarter of a block on Dallas at La Branch. This site was owned by the Stelzers and was a Harley-Davidson motorcycle dealership. They had steadfastly refused to talk to us about selling, so we had finally given up. About 5 years after our assembly, the Stelzers contacted us and said they had changed their mind and now wanted to sell. Texas Eastern said to tell them that they were no longer interested in buying the site. That ended up being the only missing piece of the puzzle. 159 out of 160 properties had been acquired. When all of this was finished, Curran prepared a 3-page special warranty deed conveying all of the property from George R. Bolin, trustee, to Houston Center Corporation. Our job was complete. Overall, it took us slightly more than a year to put it all together.